Good morning. Please turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We'll be there in just a couple of minutes. But as you're turning there, I will remind some of you, you've been here long enough, that a number of years ago I did this really long series of teachings from 1 Corinthians. And if you know 1 Corinthians very well at all, you remember some of those sermons. You remember that some of them were really challenging. I had some difficult things that I wanted to say out of that book to our church. And so one of my strategies for delivering that message is I would sometimes bring a stool out onto the stage and I would sit on the stool as I was preaching. To me, that helps make things a bit more conversational, and so I'm not just standing up here preaching at you all the time when I'm trying to say something challenging. And one Sunday, Howard and Barbara Perkins walked in and saw the stool on the stage, and Barbara said to Howard, "Why is there a stool on the stage?" And Howard, may he rest in peace, Howard said, "Don't you know? That means Wade is going to say something hard to us today." Some of you are thinking, why didn't you bring the stool out on the stage last week? That's when you really needed it. And maybe you're right. In his book, Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious, writer David Dark defines religion as one's controlling story. Not everybody believes in God. Not everyone goes to church. But everyone is religious. That's been one of the big ideas of this whole series on idolatry. We're all religious in some way. And to use Dark's language, we all have a controlling story. A story that gives our lives energy and focus. A story that allows us to channel our passion in a given direction. It's our controlling story. And some controlling stories are truer, better, more compelling, more energizing than others. One of the secrets to living a meaningful life and making a lasting difference in the world is to submit your life to the biggest, best, truest, controlling story possible. When we read through the Apostle Paul's writings, and he wrote a good portion of the New Testament, so we have a lot of his writings we could read, it's super easy to figure out what his controlling story is, isn't it? For example, listen to this passage from 1 Corinthians 9. Beginning in verse 19, he says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. And to those under the law, under the law, I became like one under the law, though myself I'm not under the law." I think he's talking about the law of Moses there. "So as to win those under the law. And to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I'm not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak." And then he summarizes the whole argument. He says, "I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. And I do all this for the sake of the gospel, so that I may share in its blessings." Those few verses are part of a much larger argument in 1 Corinthians where Paul is describing his rights as an apostle. And then he's also explaining why, though he has these rights, this power as an apostle, he willingly, gladly sets aside those rights so that they don't become unnecessary stumbling blocks or obstacles that would keep someone from becoming a Christian. You're going to be offended. Paul wants you to be offended by the cross. The scandal of the cross is the way he says it. He wants you to be offended by the gospel story, the story of the crucified and resurrected and exalted Christ. Not some secondary concern that is important to him, that he could say, I have a right to do this, I have a right to say this, I have a right to be this. It's important to him, and yet it pales in comparison with seeing others come to know Christ Jesus and be saved. And so Paul in this passage says, I willingly set aside my freedom, set aside my rights, cherished words in our culture. He says, I willingly set those aside to win as many as possible for the sake of the gospel. And he's able to do this, he's able to say this, he's able to live this, because the gospel really is his controlling story. My message today is about how there are obstacles and stumbling blocks keeping our neighbors from taking the gospel of Jesus seriously. And one of those stumbling blocks, one of those obstacles, is that for many of us as Christians, and I put myself in this group, I preach this as guilty, that for many of us as Christians, the gospel is not the controlling story of our lives. It's the quest for power. Rather than give up our rights, give up our privileges, give up our entitlements for the sake of the gospel to win as many as possible, many of us are more concerned, maybe even obsessed, that's a strong word, maybe even obsessed with gaining and maintaining and exercising a certain kind of power in our society. And this certain kind of power manifests itself in particularly destructive and divisive ways. So much so that the word I have in mind to describe this kind of power, if I were to say it out loud, I know it would immediately make some of you uncomfortable. Like, no, don't say that word in church. I didn't come to church to hear that word. And so I'm not going to say it. Standing up. I want to save it for the stool. But first I want to say a little bit more about the way power works. Power is one of the deep idols of the heart. Remember several weeks ago talking about the idol of money. We named it a surface idol that we can use to buy power, because power is a deeper idol even than money. And the greed for money is often a symptom of a much deeper greed for power. And one of the things Jesus has to do with his disciples throughout his ministry is, because power is so powerful, so seductive, so attractive, he has to reorient their ambition for and their relationship to power. How they get it, how they use it, and for whose benefit they use it. And there's a story about this in Mark chapter 10. We pick it up in Mark chapter 10, verse 35. It says, Then James and John, sons of Zebedee, came to Jesus. They said, Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. Sounds like it's a relatively small request that's coming. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked, and I have to believe there was an eye roll attached to this. What do you want me to do? And they replied, Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. Well, James and John are two of Jesus' original disciples, two of the very first to follow Jesus. They're the two that were fishing by the lake, and Jesus said, Come follow me, and they dropped their nets and they followed Jesus. They got in early, and they make this outrageous request of Jesus. Said, Jesus, we want you to reward our early support of your candidacy. We were one of the first to endorse you. We want you to reward us by giving us the two most powerful positions in your cabinet. Jesus, we know you're going to come into power. That's why we're following you. So here's what we want you to do for us. We want you, when you get it, to give us some of your power. Because, Jesus, that's why we're following you. If you keep reading the story, the other disciples learn of their request and they're scandalized. They're indignant. They're angry with them. Maybe because James and John really want to be in power over all the other disciples. How dare you? Or maybe they just got there first and all the other disciples wanted to make the same request as well. So Jesus calls his disciples in close. He says, huddle up, everybody. This is not just for James and John. I know all of you are wanting to know. I know all of you are concerned with this, so huddle up. And he begins to explain to them and show them a radically different way of gaining, maintaining, and exercising power. In other words, he shows them a radically different way of doing politics. And you go, oh no, that's the word we were hoping you wouldn't use. You said it. I did. I said it. In church. My problem with that, I don't know if that's the Lord or that's the devil. We'll have to discern that. I can't be sure. But I do appreciate it. Because we're talking about politics, and there's a lot of different ways that you could define politics. I have a very simple definition that is related to power. Politics is how we acquire and organize ourselves around power, how we distribute power, how we use power for our good, for the good of others, what we do with our power. There's kind of a power politics. There are other way of defining politics. Jay Leno had a great definition years ago. He said it's easy to define politics. Poly means many, ticks means bloodsuckers. Politics is many blood, so it's as good a definition as any. Last week's message generated a lot of feedback. Most of it was positive. Heard some really good, encouraging things, but some of it was negative. Some of what I heard expressed some challenges, some struggles. And one particular piece of feedback I received from multiple directions was, you didn't preach the gospel, you preached politics. And to that I would say you're right and you're wrong. You're right in that I did preach politics last week. Guilty as charged. You're wrong in that I didn't preach the gospel last week. From my perspective, my understanding of the gospel is political. The gospel itself is a political message. It's not that politics is what we do down here and the gospel exists up there somewhere. No, the gospel itself is a political message, not just for heaven, but also for earth. I mean, think about the very title, the name, Jesus Christ. Every time we say Jesus' name, we're making a political statement. Christ is a title. It's not Jesus' last name. Literally, it means the anointed one. In the Old Testament, it could refer to anyone who was anointed by God, but it came to mean for Israel, the king. And in Jesus' day, the Christ, the anointed one, the son of David, was the king they were waiting for, who would not only take charge of them and rule over Israel, but he would rule the whole world. It was a royal title. So when we say Jesus Christ, what we are literally saying is Jesus is the king. Jesus Christ equals King Jesus. And that, in and of itself, is a political statement. The gospel the early Christians preached was King Jesus is Lord. Not just Lord of a little territory, not just Lord of one nation, not just Lord of one region or one empire. No, he's Lord of lords, he's King of kings, he's Lord of the whole thing, all creation. And they preached this message while living in an empire ruled by a Caesar who wanted everyone to call him, guess what? Lord. And Roman officials referred to Caesar as Lord, and the Roman government had trouble with early Christianity, not just because of its religious message, but because its message was also political. Because if King Jesus is Lord, then Caesar isn't, not in any real or lasting way. And this message is no less true and no less political today than it was then. For a Christian to say King Jesus is Lord is to say that all the kings, all the dictators, all the prime ministers, all the presidents of the world are not. And if the risen King Jesus is Lord and is seated on a throne in heaven, reigning even now, then it means that the kingdom of King Jesus lasts forever. And all the kingdoms of the world, including the one we live in right now, does not. Kingdoms come and kingdoms go. But the kingdom of the Lord, the kingdom of King Jesus, lasts forever. So it is a political message. It is inherently political to say King Jesus is Lord. It is inherently political to preach the gospel. The gospel is not apolitical. It's political. But to say that, and this distinction is so important for me, please listen carefully to what I'm about to say. Please don't tune me out yet. Please don't hear what I'm not saying yet. There'll be time for that later over coffee. But right now, just hear me out. The gospel's political, but it is not partisan. And that's where we get gummed up. The gospel about King Jesus is political, but it's not partisan. The gospel cannot be reduced to any one political party. The gospel is always bigger than either one or both combined of the major political parties in our country. It's bigger than that. You can't baptize the gospel into the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. It's way too big. It can't be confined as such. Tim Keller wrote about this in an op-ed piece in the New York Times recently. Essentially, he said, Christians, you can't do partisan politics. You can't fit your gospel into any party. And one of the examples he used was the gospel calls us to work for social justice, which means we as Christians have to address the systemic forms of racial and economic injustice that exist. Now, that sounds kind of progressive and liberal, doesn't it? But at the same time, the gospel calls us to the strict sexual ethic within marriage. That sounds kind of traditional and conservative, doesn't it? Because the gospel is bigger than both. The gospel is big enough that it should offend both parties. That we do not measure the gospel according to the platform of either the Republican or Democratic Party. It's the other way around. The gospel stands in judgment of all other political platforms because it's a political message in and of itself. And it's the good news of a king who's better than all the other kings, who reigns over a kingdom that's better than all the other kingdoms. The message itself is political, and therefore so is our response to it. When we're baptized, we receive the gift of forgiveness. We receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. Also, when we are baptized, we are making a public political statement. We are confessing and declaring that King Jesus is Lord, and all the other would-be kings and lords are not. Baptism is the Christian's pledge of allegiance to the crucified, resurrected, ascended King of kings and Lord of lords who will reign forever. Baptism makes us citizens in a new family, a new community, a new nation, a new kingdom. The church is a political body all its own. The church is primary allegiance to King Jesus. That means we have a politics all our own. We have a way of using power and distributing power and working for the good of ourselves and for other people that is going to be different from all other theories and forms of power. We have a politics all our own. Another way to say that is much more simply, it's just to say that baptism adds a new we to the conversation. When someone asks a question about how do we deal with one of these troubling issues of the day, when someone says, what are we going to do about the immigration crisis at the border? What are we going to do? Our response, first response should be, who do you mean by we? Do you mean what are we as Americans going to do about the crisis at the border? Or what are we as Republicans or Democrats going to do at the crisis at the border? Or do you mean what are we as Christians, as followers of Jesus going to do about the crisis at the border. And it may be our response as Christians, the we response as Christians, overlaps with the response of the Americans and the Republicans and the Democrats, or it could be that our response as Christians, because we have different perspectives, different values, different convictions, our response is going to be very different from the way other we's respond to that question. And we see this working out on the news. There are various churches and ministries and Christian relief organizations that are responding to the crisis at the border in a vastly different way than the way the American government is currently responding to the crisis at the border. And that's exactly the way it should be. Because the church, followers of Jesus, have a politics, a way of using power all its own. Which brings me back to what Jesus teaches in Mark chapter 10. As he huddles up his disciples, they all are interested in power, and Jesus says, okay, listen up. He said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Speaking to his disciples, not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus huddles up his disciples and he says, now you know how the Gentiles do it. You know how the Roman officials do it. They have power over their subjects. It is dominion over. It is power by coercion. It's the Pax Romana. There is peace in the Roman Empire as long as nobody gets out of line. But as soon as somebody gets out of line, we wipe you off the face of the map, and that's how we restore peace. Because these Roman officials, they have power over. This is the only kind of power Jesus' disciples ever knew. It's what they grew up under. Someone always had power over them. So I can identify with their way of thinking. I can see why they want to have some power over. I was growing up, my parents made me do chores around the house. They did not give me a choice. It was power over. And I resented it. And I remember thinking, even as a little kid, you know what? I can't wait until I grow up and have kids of my own that I can force to do all the stuff around the house that I don't want to do. It is somewhat natural when someone else rules over you and you have the opportunity to get some power for yourself. You begin to think, okay, how can I use this power to rule over someone else? And Jesus' disciples, because of Jesus, they're about to come into some power, but it's unlike any other kind of power in the world. And so Christ says, we're not going to do it like the Romans. It's not going to be power over. Not in my kingdom. In my kingdom, if you want to be great, you got to be a servant. If you want to be first, you got to take the status of a slave, and a slave has no status at all. It's not going to be power over. Jesus says, we are going to exercise power under. With loving, sacrificial service. That's the power of the kingdom of God. And then Jesus says, I volunteer to lead the way on this one. I'll go first. I will not ask you to do anything I won't do myself. And so Jesus says, I may be the king, but I didn't come to be served. I came to serve others. To be a suffering servant, to give my life as a ransom. I will die in order to set the world free. This is the kind of power Jesus exhibited in his own life, in his own death. The cross saves us from sin, but it also shows us how to live, how to lead, how to do politics in a Christ-like way. And this is essentially how the early Christians lived for the first 3 centuries of the church's existence. Early Christians had no power over anyone. No power. They weren't a powerful voting bloc. They did not have the power of protest or boycotts. They had no power over anyone. All they had was the power under. Self-giving, sacrificial love. Power under. And that is what they showed their neighbors and their enemies. And you know what happened? They did such a good job loving their neighbors, unbelieving neighbors, and their enemies with power under, that many of them became Christians. So many, in fact, that early in the 3rd century, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire. What had been opposed is now accepted. Now it's legal. And then a few decades later, another emperor comes along, and he makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now the assumption is if you're going to be a good Roman, you're going to have to be a good Christian too. And this opens up a whole new set of challenges for the early church. Because now, instead of relying on power under, the power of service, they've got some power over. The church had power over in the Roman Empire. And this opened the door to all kinds of corruption in the church. Of course it did. That's what power over does. It corrupts. But it also gave Christianity the opportunity to embed Christian values deep within the heart and soul of Western civilization. And it did. And the world is better for it today. Because Christianity used its power to make a difference in the world. Now, what I see happening, and what has happened in the last 1600 years, is that Christianity has enjoyed mostly power over. It's been a power over religion in Western civilization. It's had privileges, it's had tremendous influence, and it's used those privileges and that influence for good and for ill, depending on your perspective. Other people would tell this story differently. It's had this opportunity, and it's had a tremendous impact. Certainly, it's had a tremendous impact in the history of the United States. Christianity has always been a shaping force in our country, and what has happened over the past several decades, you might even want to say the past 100 years, is that many of us as Christians are seeing our power over our society, power over in culture, we're seeing it recede or disappear altogether in some places. And it hurts. When you have enjoyed power over, it hurts to lose it. It's hard to lose power over someone else or something else. Few drugs are as intoxicating and as addictive as power over. And what many of us as Christians see happening is we're losing our power over in our culture. And we're panicking. We're thrashing about like addicts in withdrawal. And it's not pretty. It's leading us to engage in all kinds of un-Christ-like behavior. Saying and doing all kinds of un-Christ-like things in an attempt to regain or hold on to the power we sense we're losing. And that includes celebrating un-Christ-like leaders who gain our allegiance by promising to help us regain and maintain the power we sense we're losing. And we have to be careful. We have to pay attention to what we're paying attention to. The controlling story that is now shaping our lives. We have to make sure that we are not being discipled more by partisan, divisive news outlets like MSNBC and Fox News and others than we are the actual story, the gospel of Christ. We have to pay attention to the controlling story that's energizing us right now, that's inflaming our passions and arousing our anger, that's calling us to action, that's shaping our behavior. We've got to have conversations with one another, and hopefully we can be honest with one another about these conversations, that this is not a taboo subject for church. We can have a conversation and say, look, based on the way we're acting, is our controlling story the gospel? Or is it something else? Which brings me back to where I began this morning. When we Christians channel our passion and our energy and our focus into the controlling story of gaining and maintaining power over, not only does our idolatry, and it is idolatry, not only does it betray our allegiance to King Jesus, who rejected power over for himself, it also erects all kinds of these stumbling blocks and obstacles that keep our neighbors from taking Jesus more seriously. And this is the hard thing I have come to say today. This is the reason the stool is on the stage. When power over addicted Christians engage in partisan politics in unchristlike ways, it destroys the credibility of the gospel in our culture. And we're not doing it for the sake of the gospel. We're doing it in spite of our gospel convictions. Now, please don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we should not be involved as much as possible in the established political process of our day. I'm saying we should be involved. I'm saying we should be as involved in the political process in our country as our allegiance to Christ will allow us to be. Go for it. In the same way that the apostles taught the early church, the first Christians, to be good citizens of the Roman Empire up to the point of calling Caesar Lord or bowing down to him as a god, we should be good citizens of our country and participate in the political process up until the point our involvement in partisan politics leads to unchristlike behavior. And then at some point you have to draw the line. I had to give up playing pickup basketball years ago for a season because I simply could not play basketball and be a Christian at the same time. Couldn't do it. And it might be that some of us, for a season, need to give up partisan politics because we can't do partisan politics and be a good Christian at the same time. For a season. Let the Lord rehabilitate our heart. I'm not saying we shouldn't be involved. I'm just saying we shouldn't be involved to the point that we lose our distinctive Christian witness. I'm not saying we shouldn't use the freedom of speech that we enjoy in this country to speak the truth and to speak it boldly, to take a stand, to speak the truth as we understand it, to speak the truth to power, to call leaders of both political parties to account, to a higher standard, and to do so with gentleness and respect. Without attacking our opponents, without attacking members of the other party, without attacking those who disagree with us by using derisive or dehumanizing language. Even if some of the most visible leaders in our country are setting a terrible example for us in this area. One of the best parts of our political process, one of the very best parts, is we all get to give our opinion. It's called voting. And we are blessed to live in a country with a system where we get to give our opinion about who leads us, who represents us. There are amendments that we can vote up or down on. We get to give our opinion. And our opinion, our vote, absolutely should be shaped by our Christian faith. We vote not primarily as Republicans or Democrats, not down a party line. We vote as Christians. Because our country asks our opinion. Now, the worst part of our political process, one of the worst parts, is whoever they are, they get to give their opinion too. And sometimes their opinion is not the same as our opinion. Which means that there may be times when a majority of our fellow American citizens are going to give their opinion in such a way that they would solve one of the big problems of our world, our country, our society, in a way that we don't, as Christians, agree with. And we're not going to get our way. We're going to be outvoted. We're going to be in the minority on some issue, some monumentally important issue. These are not trivial matters. We may find ourselves in situations where someone, some other group, some other party, has power over us. And how we respond as followers of Jesus when we don't get our way, when we lose our power over, has a lot to say about the depth and quality and object of our faith. What are we really putting our trust in? What is really the controlling story of our lives? And it may be that God will use our not always getting our way politically to break us of our addiction to power over and to reawaken us to the power of the power under gospel. A gospel that, as followers of Jesus, loved and served others as they followed Jesus' example of sacrificial service. It changed their world. Not from above, not by coercion, not with a sword, but with love, power under. And it's that kind of power under that makes the kingdom of Christ unlike all the other kingdoms of the world. It's that kind of power under that makes Christ unlike all the other kings in the world. So may we, as followers of Christ, may we, by the power of the gospel, be set free from the idol of power, especially power over. And may we use our freedom in Christ to love and serve and imitate our King's example in such a way that it will draw others closer to Him. And may we do all of this, and may God do all of this in us for the sake of the gospel. Let's stand and sing.